Hello, I'm Warcrime Zuwu, and welcome to my video on the Wilds of Eldraine. This is the next Magic set that's coming out. It'll be pre-releasing in paper in a couple days, and releasing on Arena a couple days after that. It's a return to the plane of Eldraine, themed around fairy tales, with many of the mechanics returning. Today, we're going to be talking about the limited format, draft and sealed, and what commons and uncommons, and I do focus on commons and uncommons since that's most of what you'll see in a limited format, are the best, are the ones to look out for, how to construct a deck of the different archetypes, which pieces you're going to be looking for there, and we're just going to have a good time looking over some of the new cards. If you're new here, feel free to give it a like and a subscribe. It helps the channel grow, and I would really appreciate it. Now, what we've got on the docket today, first we're going to discuss the new and returning mechanics from Wilds of Eldraine. Then, we're going to talk through the best commons and uncommons by color. Then, we're going to go through the limited archetypes, kind of teach you what cards you should be looking out for to build each deck in Draft and Sealed. Then, we're going to talk about the best bombs, aka the rares and mythics that are most likely to just win a game on the spot. And then we're going to talk tips and tricks before I leave you for the day. So without further ado, let's get right into it. We're going to discuss the new mechanics first. So here's one of the first mechanics. It's bargain. And of all the jokes about every mechanic is just kicker, it's very true of bargain, right? You may sacrifice an artifact, enchantment, or token as you cast this spell. All of the cards with bargain say that. That's just what bargain is. And then the spell gives you a bonus. So on this combat trick, it gives +2/+2, or if you bargained it, it gives flying and lifelink as well. This one lets you filter before you draw if you bargained. This one costs less if you bargained it. And as you'll see, there are some very low-value artifacts and enchantments in the set that want to be bargained. So it's not going to be so hard to make these work. But essentially, the bargain mechanic is represented in all 5 colors. It's a little bit more pronounced in some colors, as we'll talk about when we get to the archetypes, but be on the lookout for that. And bargain does make tokens and enchantments and artifacts that want to go to the graveyard just a little bit better. Next, we've got Celebration. Now, this mechanic is essentially a characteristic of a card that is turned on as long as 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn. Now, notably, it does not say non-token permanents. So I think a lot of the time, the way that you're going to be keeping your Celebration cards online is going to be via creatures that make, say, a treasure, or what we're going to talk about in a minute, a roll, when they come in. Single cards that make 2 tokens, or that enter the battlefield and make a token when they come in, that's going to be primarily your method of keeping Celebration turned on. Next, we've got rolls. Now, these are really cool. I'm really excited to play with these. Basically, there are token auras that go on creatures, and they are only one roll per controller can be on a creature, so you cannot put multiple rolls on one of your creatures, but if you put a cursed roll on your opponent's creature, it can still have another roll from them on it that buffs it. So 5 of these rolls are positive: Monster, Sorcerer, Wicked, Royal, and Young Hero, and then Cursed is negative. We'll go over each of them. So the Monster roll gives +1/+1 and Trample. The Sorcerer roll gives +1/+1, and whenever it attacks, scry 1. The Wicked roll gets +1/+1, and whenever the aura is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life, and that includes when you replace it with a new roll. The Cursed roll, the only negative one, makes the creature's base power and toughness 1/1, although notably it does not remove their abilities. And then the Royal roll gives +1/+1 and ward 1. And then last but not least, the Young Hero roll, whenever the creature attacks, if its toughness is 3 or less, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So a great roll to give to like a rat, any kind of small creature. So these rolls are to keep in mind, and a creature can only have 1 roll at a time. So if you stuff your deck full of cards that make rolls, you might end up in a situation where like there's no creature you can apply a new roll to. So use them sort of more in moderation, but they'll definitely be helpful. They're sort of like a +1/+1 counter with upside, especially given what we'll get into in terms of enchantment synergies in the set, as well as bargain. You can't sacrifice a +1/+1 counter, but you can sacrifice a roll. And this is, I put it under new mechanics. It's the bonus sheet for this set. It seems like we're getting these a lot more often lately, starting in Strixhaven with the Mystical Archive, and then we had the Brothers War Retro Artifacts, and then in March of the Machine, we had the Multiverse Legends. So now in this set, we've got the Enchanting Tales. Now this is a bonus sheet full of, as one might assume, enchantments. So I've shown here 3 of the uncommons, and 3 of the uncommons that I expect to see a little bit of play in the limited format. We've got Griffin Aerie, Utopia Sprawl, and Stab Wound. Now these are all enchantments from Magic's history, and honestly, in terms of value, the rare and mythic slot is kind of stacked. You got Doubling Season in there, but that's a different matter. Basically, most of these feel as though they were designed to either be okay, like sort of role-player uncommons in Limited, or be unplayable in Limited, and they just needed reprints for Commander, right? A lot of the rares and mythics, things like Doubling Season, some of the ley lines, those sorts of things don't seem geared toward Limited at all, but, you know, they're reprinted for the money. But I will say that the ones that we've got on screen here, Griffin Aerie, really cool with food, because at the beginning of your end step, if you cracked a food, you get a Griffin. Utopia Sprawl is a great like ramp and fixing card that's available here, and then Stab Wound's a decent removal spell. So yeah, these are something to keep out for. You're gonna get to look out for. You're gonna get 1 per pack, and they don't really feed into the archetypes of the set much, but they do. You know, some of them are pretty good. There's a couple that are good removal spells or allow you to do like a weird build around thing. Now we're going to talk about the returning mechanics. So here we've got Adventure, and as you can see with this middle card, Woodland Acolyte here, they have updated the mechanics since last time it was in a standard set. This is the first time we're seeing Adventures that are a different color from the card that they're on, so that's pretty cool to see. There's a cycle of these at Uncommon and a cycle of these at Rare, or I guess a super cycle because it's all 10 color pairs. But in any case, the Adventures are back. Some of them are still matching the color, and then they've put Adventures on a new permanent type. So there's a cycle of Mythic enchantments that have Adventures. But anyway, Adventures work the same way they did. They're not too terribly complicated. I'll walk you through it right now. So each of these cards with an Adventure has the regular card itself, whose text box is on the right. Usually it's a creature. And then it has an adventure taking up the left half of its text box. And what that adventure is it's an instant or sorcery, and when it resolves, instead of putting it in your graveyard, you exile it on an adventure, so it goes in its own sort of special, you can think of it as the adventure zone, right? And then while it's in the adventure zone, you can cast the creature half of it. So important to note, once you've cast the creature, you've kind of said no thanks on the adventure. If you cast the creature directly from your hand, which you can do, you cannot then later cast the adventure. That's important to remember, unless the creature gets bounced or, you know, returned to your hand from your graveyard or something later. And once you have cast the adventure, if the adventure fizzles for some reason, for example, if it targets your opponent's creature and then they sack it, unfortunately, your adventure creature does go to the graveyard. You don't get to cast it again later. So next we're going to talk about food. This is another returning mechanic, and this has been back at different capacities in different sets. It honestly, it's not on the level of sagas, but it kind of feels like more of a recurring thing. It's not quite treasures, but it comes back from time to time. And basically, they're just artifacts that you can pay to, tap, and sack them to gain 3 life. Now, of course, in the sets where food matters, there's other synergies for them. Maybe whenever you sack a food, do this, or you can sack a food to do this instead of gaining 3 life. You know, that sort of thing. And this set is certainly no stranger to that, as we'll get into. One of the archetypes is food-based. But essentially, there's just cards that make food, and cards that care about food. For instance, this Saga, whose last mode puts counters on a creature for each food you control. Alright, now we're going to start talking about the best commons and uncommons in each color, and just sort of how high quality I think each color is. So white, I think, has a lot to work with. And here in the best commons, I've selected 2 removal spells, and then 1 of what I think is just an insane 2-drop. So the first removal spell is Cooped Up. It's 1 and a white for an aura, enchant creature. Enchanted creature can't attack or block, and you can pay 2 and a white to exile enchanted creature. So this is an upgrade from Pacifism, and in a set where there's no vehicles, right, and not a lot of the creatures seem to have that many activated or triggered abilities, Pacifism gets a lot better, right, because you look at sets that have a lot of vehicles and things like that, and you have to think, oh, well, you know, they have to add a line of text to the Pacifism that says they can't crew vehicles and make it cost 1 more mana. Here they don't need to do that. And the ability to exile the enchanted creature if you are scared of them removing the aura or something is really helpful. The other thing is, maybe you need to use Cooped Up to get the aggro off you early in the game, but then once you've stabilized, you can sack it to bargain because it is an enchantment. So you have a lot of options. You can, I guess, technically also if you have an instant with bargain, you can do a fun trick where you pay the 3 to exile the enchanted creature, holding priority while that trigger is on the stack. You can sack the cooped up to bargain, which is pretty fun. And then we've got Hopeful Vigil. This is the 2-drop role player I was thinking of. And this card is going to look better and better as we dive into the archetypes, right? There's an archetype around Celebration where 2 permanents have to enter the battlefield. Well, I guess I should probably read the card first. I'm getting ahead of myself. It's a common 1 and a white for an enchantment. When Hopeful Vigil enters the battlefield, create a 2/2 white knight creature token with Vigilance. When Hopeful Vigil is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, scry 2. And you can pay 2 and a white to sacrifice Hopeful Vigil if you're tired of waiting for that scry 2, right? So this card is insane. It is 2 mana for a 2/2 Vigilance is perfectly serviceable. Not to mention the fact that in the deck that cares about 2 permanents entering the battlefield, right? This is 2 permanents entering the battlefield because you get the token and you get the Hopeful Vigil itself. In the bargain decks, you're going to be able to sack this to bargain and get to scry 2 off of it without actually sacking the thing you put the mana into, really, which is the creature. There's decks that care about enchantments going to the graveyard, and this will benefit a great deal. So Hopeful Vigil is a crazy good 2-drop at common. Speaking of crazy good 2-drops at common, we've got another piece of removal, Kellen's Lightblades. 1 and a white for a bargain. For an instant with bargain, excuse me. It deals 3 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. If the spell was bargained, destroy that creature instead. So we see this sort of standard, like, lightning strike on an attacking creature or blocking creature that white tends to get. Sometimes it can do 4 damage depending on the set. I know the one in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty did 4 damage. But the fact that you can bargain this off of like a roll that's sitting around or a treasure or something similar if you need to destroy something bigger adds a lot of flexibility to the card. So I would say it's definitely worth looking out for as a removal spell. Next, we're looking at the best uncommons in white. So here's a reprint from original Eldraine. This is Glass Casket. It's 1 and a white for an artifact. When Glass Casket enters the battlefield, exile target creature an opponent controls with mana value 3 or less until Glass Casket leaves the battlefield. So a couple of interesting things with this. It can get rid of a token permanently and then be bargained away. That's sort of a synergy there. If the thing is not actually trapped under it, then you can bargain the Glass Casket away. It can get rid of a lot of what I think will be relevant creatures in the format. There's some relevant creature tokens, and there's just a lot of relevant creatures that cost 3 or less, so it's pretty efficient removal. And then we've got the Princess Takes Flight. 2 and a white for a Saga. Step 1, exile up to 1 target creature. Step 2, target creature you control gets +2/+2 and gains flying until end of turn. Step 3, return the exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control. So there's a couple of really neat things you can do with this. Firstly, you've got the option to exile your own creature to take advantage of its enters the battlefield trigger again. But the coolest thing I think you can do with this is actually exiling a creature with its first mode, letting it give one of your creatures +2/+2 and flying until end of turn, and then sacrificing it before you have to give it back. Because I think it's intended to be sort of like a Banishing Light effect that expires, but there's this hidden synergy, or I guess maybe not so hidden, where the third trigger, the return an exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control, is actually separate from the first trigger. The first trigger does not say until this card leaves the battlefield. So you can exile their thing and then sack this Saga in order to not have to give their thing back. And there's plenty of ways to do that. So a really neat design here. And then we've got Discerning Financier. 2 and a white for a 2/3 with this lovely Wayne Reynolds art. It's a human noble. At the beginning of your upkeep, if an opponent controls more lands than you, create a treasure token. Okay, interesting, fine, but I'm not sold. 2 and a white. Choose another player. That player gains control of target treasure you control. You draw a card. So this card's awesome. The fact that if you are going second, it is sort of ramp. But also, if you don't have anything to spend those treasures on, your opponent probably doesn't have anything to spend theirs on either. Maybe you've both played all the cards in your hand. You're going to be exchanging those cards to draw cards. Or exchanging those treasures, rather, excuse me, to draw cards. And the other thing being that, like, you have the ability to do that. Your opponent's probably not going to have anything better to spend those treasures on than you if you're that late in the game. And you can start sandbagging lands so you're always getting a treasure token every turn. So there's a lot of interesting play with this card, and I'm curious to see how it'll work out. Now we're going to talk about the best commons in blue. So here we're going to start off with Merfolk Coralsmith. 2 and a blue for a 2/3 Merfolk. You can pay 1 to give it +1/-1 until end of turn. And when Merfolk Coralsmith dies, scry 2. Now, this kind of weirdly reminds me of Storm God's Oracle, one of the blue-red commons from Modern Horizons 2, in that it has this sort of Aetherling ability where it can increase its power and decrease its toughness, and it does something when it dies. Now, it doesn't bolt something when it dies like Oracle of the Storm God did, but the fact that you can pay 1 mana and it trades as a 3/2, you can pay another mana and it becomes a 4/1, right? So it's really good at potentially trading in combat. And then when it dies, you're going to scry 2. So you're going to feel great about playing this as a 3-drop in your blue deck. Next, we've got Quick Study, which is actually really interesting because the sort of divination variant, right? The 2 and a blue, draw 2 cards with like some sort of relevant thing from the set that maybe makes it cost 1 more mana or whatever, has been around forever. But this is the first time that we've ever just gotten divination at instant speed, right? So Quick Study is 2 and a blue for an instant, draw 2 cards. That's not a lot of text, but it's really interesting to see because it feels like in recent years, divination has just not made the cut in any limited format. You'd be hard-pressed to find a limited format where you want a sorcery speed, 3 mana, draw 2 cards. And the question is Quick Study, is making it an instant better enough? And it remains to be seen. I guess we'll find out. So that's an interesting question for it to ask us. And then the last common we've got here is Johan's Stopgap. 3 and a blue for a sorcery with Bargain. The spell costs 2 less to cast if it's bargained. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Draw a card. So if you have something to sack, then this can just be a 2 mana Blink of an Eye. Or Into the Royal if you prefer. Either way, this card seems pretty solid. Just paying 4 mana for that effect at sorcery speed doesn't feel bad. That's historically been a pretty good tempo play. You bounce something relevant of theirs and you're drawing a card. But being able to potentially do it for 2 if you have something sitting around to bargain is pretty powerful. Next, we're going to talk about the best uncommons in blue. And I want to start with Archive Dragon. 6 mana, 4/6, flying, Ward 2, so it's 4 and double blue for a 4/6 Dragon Wizard. Flying and Ward 2. When Archive Dragon enters the battlefield, scry 2. So this body is relevant. The ward ensures that even if your opponent has an efficient removal spell, they're going to have to spend pretty much all their mana to deal with it. And it scries 2 when it comes in. And if they don't deal with it, a 4/6 body is incredibly significant. It's a great blocker against a Fairies deck. It's a great attacker to top off a sort of more controlling deck. So Archive Dragon's great to look out for. Picklock Prankster is 1 and a blue for a Fairy Rogue. It's a 1/3 with Flying and Vigilance. So that's great stats, but it's also got an adventure. Free the Fae. For 1 and a blue is an instant. Mill 4 cards, then put an instant, sorcery, or fairy card from among the milled cards into your hand. So this is great in that Fairy Tribal deck. It's great in that Spell Slingers sort of deck. It's great in any deck that cares about adventures. And then we've got Splashy Spellcaster. Now this guy is 3 and a blue for a 2/4 Elemental Wizard. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a Sorcerer role token attached to up to 1 other target creature you control. So for those who don't remember, that Sorcerer role token gives +1/+1, and whenever this creature attacks, scry 1. So I think the thing that's mainly hindering this is the fact that it can't target itself and become a 3/5 that scries 1 when it attacks. But if you have any other creatures out, putting a Sorcerer role on them is crazy, especially in a deck with maybe some flyers, like the Fairies deck comes to mind. And it's not that hard to trigger this, right? It's not asking you to cast a bunch of instants and sorceries. It's just saying, like, hey, you're playing a removal spell. Go ahead and just give one of your creatures a Sorcerer roll, and then the creature, feels great in terms of rate. Moving on to black, here are the 3 best commons in black, in my opinion. We're starting with Fell Horseman. 3 and a black for a 3/3 Zombie Knight, with when Fell Horseman dies, put it on the bottom of its owner's library. And with the adventure, Deathly Ride, 1 and a black for a sorcery, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So this is sort of the Raise Dead variant of the set. It's going to return something to your hand, and then when it dies, it goes on the bottom of its owner's library, so you can't repeat it over and over again. But basically, it's a hill giant with an adventure of a 2 mana Raise Dead. which is just a pretty decent rate. Nothing to sneeze at. And then we've got Minstrosity, which is one of the few sort of aggressive creatures in the set. It's 1 and a black for a 3/1 horror. When Minstrosity dies, create a food token. So this is a pretty decent creature. You know, it kind of trades and then leaves behind a food token, which your deck might be able to particularly do something with, which is pretty cool. And then we've got Conceited Witch. I can't believe they designed a card after my ex-wife. She's 2 and a black for a 2/3 human warlock. Now, she has Menace, so a 3-mana, 2/3 Menace doesn't feel great, but she's got an adventure, Price of Beauty, which is a single black for a sorcery. Create a Wicked Roll token attached to target creature you control. So, that's going to help her stats sort of even out. And for those who don't remember, that Wicked Roll is +1/+1, and when the Wicked Roll is put in the graveyard, target opponent loses 1 life, or each opponent. Your opponent loses 1 life in Limited. So you can kind of buff one of your creatures when you have a mana sitting around, and then get a Menace creature. You know, and she's good to put rolls on because of that Menace as well. You know, give her something like another Wicked Roll token, right? And then she's a 3/4 Menace, which is a solid body. It's going to be hard for your opponent to trade with. Going into the best uncommons in black, we're going to start with a Saga, the Witch's Vanity. 1 and a black. Destroy target creature an opponent controls with mana value 2 or less, is step 1. And then step 2 is create a food token. And then step 3 is create a Wicked Roll token attached to target creature you control. So I want you to look at this as sort of the last 2 modes are just icing on the cake. The blowing up your opponent's 2-drop with your 2-drop is kind of the ideal here, right? Destroying a creature with mana value 2 or less. And then the food and the Wicked Roll are just extra, added on. So then we've got Twisted Sewer Witch, which is 3 and double black for a 3/4 human warlock. When Twisted Sewer Witch enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 black rat creature token with this creature can't block. Then, for each rat you control, create a Wicked Roll token attached to that rat. So just looking at this at baseline, you're paying 5 mana, you're getting a 3/4, and you're getting a 2/2 as well that can't block. Now, also, whenever that 2/2 attacks, or whenever that 2/2 dies, or you replace that roll for some reason, your opponent's going to lose a life, which is also pretty nice. Not to mention the fact that if you have any other rats, this gets insane. So definitely a great uncommon to look out for, a great 5-drop. Next, we've got Taken by Nightmares, 2 and double black for an instant. Exile target creature. If you control an enchantment, scry 2. Now, 4 mana to exile a creature at instant speed is pretty great, regardless of if you control an enchantment. But if you don't remember, the bonus sheet in this set is all enchantments, right? So there's going to be just a higher concentration of enchantments going around the table in this set. It's going to be realistic for you to control an enchantment, even sometimes in the case where your deck doesn't care about it. So Taken by Nightmares seems like a very solid removal spell. Next, we're on to red, and we're going to talk about the best commons. And here we've got first Grabby Giant, 3 and a red for a 4/3 reach that lets you pay 2 and a red to sacrifice an artifact or land and draw a card. And then it's also got an adventure called That's Mine. It's 1 and a red for an instant, create a treasure token. Now that adventure is not very efficient, but if you take your time to do the adventure, then it does give you something to sack to draw a card for cheap on the Grabby Giant's ability. Now, in Limited, like a 4 mana 4/3 reach is just almost playable, but I think the ability to let you sort of sack your lands late in the game to try to find some action really pushes this into good territory. Next we've got Cut In. Now this is a removal spell. It's 3 and a red for a sorcery at common. Cut In deals 4 damage to target creature. Create a young hero roll attached to up to 1 target creature you control. Now, this, to me, seems excellent in an aggressive deck, right? You remove your opponent's blocker that they were hoping to use to sort of stem the tide, and then you also put this young hero roll on your token, which, to remind you, whenever this creature attacks, if its toughness is 3 or less, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So I'm envisioning you spending the first couple turns playing small creatures, and then your opponent plays a blocker that obviates them, you cut in on that blocker and put the young hero roll on the smallest creature you control, so that hopefully it can get 1, maybe even 2 counters out of that roll. And then, you're getting maximum value out of this common. And then we've got Torch the Tower. Single red for an instant with Bargain. And to note, Bargain is especially good with the young hero roll, because if you've put enough counters on the creature that now it has more 3 or more toughness, or it has more than 3 toughness, then the bargain is going to get even better. You can sacrifice that young hero role that's not doing anything more to the bargain and get some extra value out of it. So Torch of the Tower is an instant with Bargain for a single red, deals 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If this spell was bargained, instead it deals 3 damage to that permanent, and you scry 1. If a permanent dealt damage by Torch of the Tower would die this turn, exile it instead. So this is at baseline a shock for a creature, right? Which they've put so much other relevant text on. The exile if it dies, as well as, importantly, the ability to sack something to bargain to turn it instead into a bolt that scries 1. So a lot of flexibility on this card, but even just that Magma Spray, right? Or Magma Jet. I think it's Magma Spray. It's a shock that exiles the creature. Very valuable to have. Good to see. And then we've got the best uncommons in red. Now, here's another removal spell, right? Red's removal is pretty good in this set. We've got Witchstalker Frenzy. 3 in a red for an instant. The spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature that attacked this turn. Witchstalker Frenzy deals 5 damage to target creature. Now, notably, this can be used offensively in terms of, like, I'm swinging with my creatures, and then I'm getting a discount on this spell to remove one of your blockers. But it can also be used defensively, which is weird to see for a red spell. It just cares about the number of creatures that attacked this turn, not that they were necessarily yours. So let's say your opponent swings in with 3 creatures, you've got an instant for a single red that deals 5 damage to one of them. I think this card is, like, high pickable. It's just so much flexibility, because 4 mana for 5 damage and instant speed is passable. But the fact that it, like, 2 creatures attack, this is 2 mana for 5 damage and instant speed, crazy. So now we're going to talk about Korvold and the Noble Thief. This is a saga, it's 3 in a red, and longtime fans of the channel and my friends who I'm bothering with this video, you will know how much I love stealing other people's cards. Step 1 and 2 of this saga is to create a treasure token, and step 3 is exile the top 3 cards of target opponent's library. You may play those cards this turn. So if you can hold on to those treasure tokens, this is definitely a slowed card that, like, will, give you some payoff later. But the fact that you can hold on to those treasure tokens to be able to cast those cards, because remember, it does not fix their mana. It's like Ragavan. You have to actually have the mana to cast it, have the colors to cast it. So you can play a land off the top 3, right, which will kind of help you there. But you're maybe relying on those treasures to hit their colors to cast those spells. But the fact that this will ramp you a little bit of mana, give you a little treasures, and then give you 3 cards with the last mode, right? Very, very cool. Maybe I'm a little biased. I just love stealing other people's cards, so even though this card isn't very powerful, I'm just so excited about it that it's in here, but I guess time will tell. Now, a card that's definitely powerful is going to be Embereth Veteran. Single red for a 2/1 human knight, pay 1, sacrifice Embereth Veteran, create a young hero role token attached to another target creature. So this is Savannah Lions, and Savannah Lions are dubious and limited given that they get outclassed so quickly, but this kind of comes with a built-in solution to that problem, where once it gets outclassed, you can sack it to put a young hero role on a more relevant creature that can maybe get in and be the right size to be doing combat at that phase in the game. Now, of course, the young hero role is only relevant on another small creature, but you can put it on a creature that's got some evasion, perhaps. Next, we've got the best commons in green. So first we're going to talk about Curse of the Werefox, which is our sort of fight spell of the set. It's 2 and a green for a sorcery. Create a monster role token attached to target creature you control. When you do, that creature fights up to 1 creature you don't control. So what the monster roll is, again, is that +1/+1 and trample. So you're doing one of your creatures +1/+1 and trample roll, and then you're having it fight one of their creatures. So it's a perfectly solid removal spell. Pretty efficient, gives you something permanently left behind. Of course, it carries the burden of every fight spell, which is that if your opponent gets rid of your creature in response, then you got 2 for 1. But, be wary of that. Hamlet Glutton is 5 and double green for a 6/6 giant. With bargain, it costs 2 less if it's bargained. It has trample, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life. So the typical play pattern here, I think, is going to be to sack either a roll or a food, and when you do, you are getting a 5 mana 6/6 and gaining 3 life. And it's got trample. So, this is sort of the Colossal Dreadmaw of the set, and I think it's doing a good job being that. You know, in a food deck, you're not even going to miss the food, really, because this gains you 3 life when it comes in. It's as if he's eating the food for you and reducing his own cost. Next, we've got Troublemaker Oof, which is 1 and a green for a 2/2 Oof with Bargain. And when Troublemaker Oof enters the battlefield, if it was bargained, exile target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls. Now, this is good because it is both just filling the role of a 2-drop if your deck needs a 2-drop, but also it's going to serve as removal because, you know, the bonus sheet is those enchantments. So there's going to be at least a few probably decent enchantments that you're going to want to have an answer to in your deck, but you don't want to include a card in your deck that's dedicated to just removing those things. So the fact that this is just a 2-mana 2/2, right, it can be, in the worst case, it can be just a Grizzly Bear. Gives this card some flexibility. Those sagas also sometimes need to be answered. So Troublemaker Oof is pretty good for that. Now we've got the best uncommons. Welcome to Sweet Tooth is our saga for green. It's 1 and a green for an uncommon saga. Step 1, create a 1/1 white human creature token. Step 2, create a food token. Step 3, put X +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, where X is 1 plus the number of foods you control. So at the very least, right, if you just have this card, you are going to be putting 2 +1/+1 counters on the human, right? You're going to, at the end of this saga, you're going to have a 3/3 and a food, right? Because it's 1 plus the number of foods you control. Now, in the intermittent period, did you make some new foods? Did you find a better creature to put the +1/+1 counters on? Then the ceiling of this card goes up, right? But I think it's perfectly serviceable, even without synergy. So that's Welcome to Sweet Tooth. Then we've got Stormkeld Vanguard. It's 4 and double green for a 6/7 giant warrior. So 6 mana, 6/7, can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. And then it's got a adventure, Bear Down, 1 and a green for a sorcery, destroy target artifact or enchantment. So like I mentioned with the Oof, destroying enchantments is going to be a little more relevant in this set than usual. So having a decently sized creature that you'd be fine with playing, but that also can answer artifacts and enchantments with its adventure is really key. So this is a great thing to pick up in your draft. And then we've got Howling Galefang, 2 and double green for a 4/4 beast with vigilance. So decent stats already. And then it has haste as long as you own a card in exile that has an adventure. So if you send one of your creatures on an adventure, then this guy has haste, and he can just kind of take a chunk off of your opponent's life total before, you know, when maybe they're needing to they're trying to stabilize. If this is like sort of a more top end of your aggro deck, or just kind of a late game play. So that's Howling Galefang. It does seem like green is a little bit weak in this set, to be honest. I had trouble finding like my favorite cards for green. It just doesn't seem like the color is all that strong, or where it is, it's on multicolored cards. Like green's Signpost Uncommons seem very good, but I think it might be leaning on other colors to find its footing to an extent. So here we're going to talk about the limited archetypes. These are the decks that you're going to be trying to build and draft and sealed, right? The things you're going to try to see coming together. They're all signified by their Signpost Uncommon, of course. And then there's a cycle of uncommon off-color adventure creatures. Some of them have to do with their archetypes, so I've included them where they do. But I'm going to talk about the cards that just sort of exemplify these archetypes to me. So our first color pair is Selesnya, green-white. And what we've got here is auras/rolls. So looking at this powerful Signpost Uncommon, Sir Armant the Redeemer, 3, a green and a white for a 4/4 human knight. When Sir Armand the Redeemer enters the battlefield, create a monster roll token attached to another target creature you control. Enchanted creatures you control get +1/+1. So worth noting, Sir Armand cannot put the monster roll on herself. Otherwise, she could just be a 5-mana 6/6 trample, which is, you know, pretty great. She has to put it on another creature, but that can be, you know, an upside. The fact that you maybe have a creature that couldn't swing before that can now safely swing, and your opponent wasn't accounting for that, because the creature basically has +2/+2 in trample from Sir Armand, because the monster roll plus the enchanted creatures that you control get +1/+1 buff. But also worth noting, if you can put a roll on her through some other card, she will give herself +1/+1 because she'll then be an enchanted creature. So she's got this sort of, she's got a decent body, 5-mana 4/4, plus the monster roll and something else, and then a lot of places to find that synergy there. So then we got Red Tooth Vanguard, 1 and a green for a 3/1 Elf Warrior with Trample. Whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay 2. If you do, return Red Tooth Vanguard from your graveyard to your hand. So this card is pretty interesting. A 2-mana 3/1 trades really well. The fact that the rat tokens in the set can't block makes these 3/1s a lot better at getting in because they don't have to worry about accidentally trading for a 1/1. Or not accidentally, but not being able to attack because of the worry of trading with a 1/1. So the 3/1s are a little bit better for that reason. It's a nice aggressive body, a 2-mana 3/1 trample. And the fact that late in the game, when you play a roll or some such thing, being able to pay 2 to return this to your hand to play it back down, when this card with a roll on it is pretty relevant. You know, there's board states where a 4/2, they at least have to trade with it. It's a great thing to put the Young Hero roll on it, because, you know, it only has 1 toughness, so if it gets to grow all the way through that Young Hero roll, then it'll become a 6/4. But all that said, it's a good 2-drop. And then we've got Charmed Clothier, 4 and a white for a 3/3 Fairy Advisor with flying. When Charmed Clothier enters the battlefield, create a Royal Roll token attached to another target creature you control. So again, that Royal Roll is +1/+1 and Ward 1. So a 5-mana 3/3 flyer is a little rough in 2023. We look at things like Koilos Rock in Brothers War, which was like just playable. It was one of my favorite cards in the set, but it was just playable because it had flash, so it could come in and eat something and then give you a Power Stone so you could ramp up to a big prototype thing. This card is probably about on par with that. The +1/+1 and Ward 1 on another creature is nice. It's just enough, I think, to make this card good. It can, especially with Sur Armant in play or a similar card that benefits rolls. This card also it's worth noting turns on your celebration effects because it and the roll are both entering. So a lot of relevance there for Charmed Clothier. And then we've got Curse of the Werefox. We talked about this in the Best Green Commons. Put a monster roll on something and fight. So that's going to trigger your roll, or that's going to enable your roll synergies, and it's a removal spell. Then we've got Tangle Span Lookout, 2 and a green for a 2/3 Satyr. Whenever an aura enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So this is going to, anytime you make a roll, which you should be doing every couple turns in this deck, you're going to be drawing a card, which is huge. You put a roll on this guy, he's, maybe a 3/4 and ready to go in. That's pretty good. So Tanglespan Lookout is sort of, an enchantress, which is nice to have. And then we've got Slumbering Keep Guard, a white for a 1/1 human knight. Whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, scry 1. And then you can pay 2 and a white to give Slumbering Keep Guard +1/+1 until end of turn for each enchantment you control. And there's actually no limit on how many times that can be activated. So say your creatures have a few rolls on them. Let's say you maybe control 3 enchantments, which is a lot but not unreasonable, and you have 6 mana. You can suddenly make this guy a 7/7, right? And swing in. So that's pretty cool. And the scrying 1 when enchantments come in really is going to help you filter for your best draws. So something to look out for. Now we're going to talk about the archetype that's probably the most personally exciting to me to see what they do with it. We've got white-blue Tap Down. Now in most sets, there's a couple of white and blue cards that tap your opponent's creatures that don't really do enough because they sort of act as fogs, right? They're only prolonging your loss instead of doing something permanent. But this set, white-blue is all about tapping down your opponent's creatures, and it incentivizes this with cards that give you a bonus for doing so. So we're going to look at some of those cards now, and some of them are pretty powerful. So the signpost in common is Sheree of Numbing Depths. She's a 4-mana 2/3 Merfolk Wizard. When she comes in, tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. So those stun counters being they don't untap, and you remove the stun counter instead. And then whenever you tap one or more untapped creatures your opponents control, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. So even without any synergy, this card is a 4-mana 2/3 that when it comes in, you tap something, put a stun counter on it, and draw a card. That's pretty great. But then if this sticks around and you tap something by other means, you're going to get to draw another card. So this is a pretty great card, I think, in that you take it thinking I've just got a decent blue-white tempo deck, not leaning that much into the tapping down stuff. But it's always there, and now you pick some cards up later in the draft that tap stuff down, and they're insane with your Signpost Uncommon. You've sort of got this synergy going. So we've got Solitary Sanctuary, 2 and a white for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. And whenever you tap an untapped creature an opponent controls, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So sort of a more understated version of Charade. It's got the same enters the battlefield trigger. It's not a creature, so it can't be like hit by removal, which is cool. But instead of drawing you a card, it just puts a +1/+1 counter on one of your creatures, which is good for assembling a board state that's going to win the game. So definitely something to look out for. And then we've got Ice Rot Sentry, 2 and a blue for a 2/3 elemental soldier with vigilance. Whenever Ice Rot Sentry attacks, you may pay 1 and a blue. When you do, tap target creature an opponent controls. Whenever you tap an untapped creature an opponent controls, Ice Rot Sentry gets +2/+1 until end of turn. So this is a 3-drop that's great for attacking like late in the game. You have 2 mana lying around, and this is a 4/4 when you attack and pay 2 and tap down a blocker. I like Ice Rot Sentry a lot. I think it's a pretty solid card. And then we've got some other sort of role players. We've got Frostbridge Guard, 2 mana, 2/2 elemental soldier, 2 and a white tap target creature. This is a continuous way to activate your tap synergies, right? It's a way to do it repeatedly, consistently on a 2-drop. So you love to see that if you're trying to dedicate yourself to that deck. And then we've got Plunge into Winter, 1 and a white for an instant. Tap up to 1 target creature, scry 1, then draw a card. So this card seems pretty solid if you have those tap synergies going on. The fact that it replaces itself. If you have even one card out that cares about tapping stuff down, this card's going to be pretty good. Then you've got Freeze in Place, which is a sorcery. It's 1 and a blue. Tap target creature an opponent controls and put 3 stun counters on it. Scry 2. So this is going to take one of your opponent's creatures out of commission for a decent while, and let you scry to sort of filter your draws to maybe help you take advantage of the fact that that creature's gone for a few turns. And then, of course, that tap is going to synergize with any of your tap-down things going on in the deck. And there are a lot of them in the set. Next, we're going to talk about Blue-Black, which is Fairy Tribal. So, Fairy Tribal back from Lorwyn, commonly requested. It doesn't look like these cards are very powerful constructed-wise, but there's definitely some interesting stuff going on Unlimited. So we're going to start with Obira, Dreaming Duelist, which is the Signpost Uncommon. It's a blue and a black for a 2/2 Flash Flyer Fairy Warrior Legendary. Whenever another fairy enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life. So the body's great, 2 mana, 2/2 Flash Flyer. You can flash it in an Eat a Rat, I guess, or you can just flash it on your opponent's end step and immediately attack with it. And then every time you're playing another fairy, each opponent loses 1 life. Definitely solid, nothing to sneeze at. And then we've got Picklock Prankster, 1 and a blue for a Fairy Rogue, 1/3. We talked about this one when I was talking about the best blue uncommons, but it's just an efficient fairy body. 2 mana, 1/3 Flying Vigilance is good at swinging. And then we've got Fairy Fencing, X and a green for an instant. Target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn. That creature gets an additional -3/-3 until end of turn if you controlled a fairy as you cast this spell. So just a sort of black fireball removal spell on a creature, but if you have a fairy, it's an additional -3/-3. So, if it's a small creature, you can just pay a single black to kill something. X can be 0. Or if it's a larger creature, then having that fairy can maybe allow you to kill it despite not having enough mana. And then we've got some other fairies to consider. Stingblade Assassin, 3 and a black for a 3/1 Flash Flyer. Decent body right there, 4 mana, 3/1 Flash Flyer. But when it enters the battlefield, destroy target creature an opponent controls that was dealt damage this turn, so you can block with one of your 1/3 fairies and then finish the thing off with this. Snaremaster Sprite is a single blue for a 1/1 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, you may pay 2. When you do, tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. So, decent. And then Barrow Naughty, 1 and a black for a 1/3 flyer that has lifelink as long as you control another fairy. And you can pay 2 and a black to give it +1/+0 until end of turn. So later in the game, if this is, swinging and you've got mana lying around, you could turn that into a bigger life swing. Nothing to sneeze at, for sure. Now we're going to talk about Black-Red, which is Rat Tribal / Bargain. This is kind of a weird thing going on. The deck definitely cares about rats, but it also cares about sacking them, obviously, because the rats are kind of as weak as a token can get. So the rat token is a 1/1 black rat that can't block. So we're going to look at the signpost uncommon is Totentan's Swarm Piper, which is 1, a black and a red for a 2/3 human warlock bard. Whenever Totentans or another non-token creature you control dies, you make a rat, and you can pay 1 in a black, target attacking rat you control gains Death Touch until end of turn. So this card's a perfect example of the threat of activation, right? Your rats are going to be able to get in for damage because, not because you've given them Death Touch, but because you can give them Death Touch, right? You have this guy out, you swing in with your rats, your opponent's not going to block them because you can pay to give them Death Touch if you want to and trade with their bigger creatures. But they're not going to, so you don't have to, so then you get to the second mana and you can spend a mana on a creature. And then we've got Twisted Sewer Witch, which we talked about. If you're building a deck where you have several rats, then giving all of them a Wicked roll is pretty crazy. So Twisted Sewer Witch is a great top end to that deck. We've got Tattered Ratter, which is 1 in a red for a 2/2 human peasant. Whenever a rat you control becomes blocked, it gets +2/0 until end of turn. So this sort of fulfills the same role as Totentans, in terms of your opponents being unlikely to want to block your rats while this guy is out. Because if they don't block with at least something with 4 toughness, they're going to kill their creature. So, they're more likely to let that rat damage through, which is the goal of the deck. And then we've got Voracious Vermin, which is 2 and a black for a 2/1. When Voracious Vermin enters the battlefield, you make a rat token. And whenever another creature you control dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on Voracious Vermin. So if you have a way to bargain away these rats, because bargain you can sack a token, or if you're just sending these rats into battle with the threat of Death Touch and some of them are trading, then you're making this Voracious Vermin bigger and bigger. So this sort of unruly mob effect, but it makes a token when it comes in, is kind of crazy. So definitely want to keep an eye out for that. And then we've got Lord Skitter's Butcher, 2 and a black for a 2/3 rat peasant. When Lord Skitter's Butcher enters the battlefield, choose one. You can either make a rat, or you can sack another creature to scry 2 and draw a card, or you can give your creatures menace until end of turn. So the menace until end of turn is not great. I think we're looking more at the first 2 modes in terms of like a 3-mana 2/3 that makes a rat, perfectly fine. A 3-mana 2/3, you got some rats lying around, you sack one to scry 2 and draw a card, that feels great. So this card just has a lot of versatility. It's a great uncommon. And then we've got Ratcatcher Trainee, which is 1 in a red for a 2/1. As long as it's your turn, Ratcatcher Trainee has first strike. So it's a 2-mana 2/1 first strike on your turn, which is already awesome. But it's also got this adventure Pest problem, which is 2 in a red for an instant, create 2 rat tokens, the 1/1s that can't block, right? So you have the modality of like this this adventure automatically turns on Celebration because it's 2 non-land permanents entering the battlefield. And as well, it's giving you these rats for the rat synergies. So definitely a very versatile card, but I think it's especially at home here in the rat deck. And then our last ally-colored pair, we've got Ramp/Ferocious. So Ferocious being that cards that care about you controlling a creature with power 4 or greater. So we're looking at Ruby Daring Tracker for the signpost in common. She's a red and a green, so 2 mana for a 1/2 legendary human scout. She's got haste. Whenever she attacks while you control a creature with power 4 or greater, she gets +2/+2 until end of turn, and she can tap for a red or a green. So she's a ramp creature that's going to help you, get out these bigger guys. She's a mana dork. And then also, once you have one of these bigger guys out, she's a 3/4 attacking. So really, really great card here. And then we're going to look at Minecart Daredevil, which is a 3 mana 4/2, 2 in a red for a 4/2 Dwarf Knight, with no abilities on the creature, but it does have an adventure. Ride the Rails, 1 in a red for an instant. Target creature gets +2/+1 until end of turn. So a crappy combat trick, but stapled to an efficient way to get 4 power out on the board to turn on your ferocious effects. Then we've got Verdant Outrider, which I'm looking at as just another efficient way to turn on your ferocious. It's 2 and a green for a 4/2 human knight, and you can pay 1 and a green to make it unblockable by creatures with power 2 or less this turn, so your opponent can't as easily trade up with it. And then we've also got here Root Rider Fawn, which is 1 and a green for a 1/3 Satyr Scout. You can tap it and add a green, or you can pay 1 and tap it to add 1 mana of any color, so it can filter your mana as well. It's just a mana dork that's going to help you get to those big creatures. Grabby Giant, which we've already talked about, but it's a 4-power creature that helps you turn on those effects. Then we've got Territorial Witchstalker, which is a great common for this deck. It's 1 and a green for a 2/3 Defender Wolf. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, Territorial Witchstalker gets +1/+0 until end of turn and can attack this turn as though it didn't have Defender. So it's a nice aggressive creature if you have Ferocious. Now we're going to talk about another another archetype that I'm very excited to play with in this limited format. That being white-black enchantment graveyard. So looking at the signpost in common, it's Neva, Stalked by Nightmares. 2, a white and a black for a 2/2 human noble with menace. When it enters the battlefield, return target creature or enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand. Whenever an enchantment you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on Neva and then scry 1. So, important to remember that when you overwrite a roll, right, you can only have one roll per creature. When you overwrite a roll, that roll is going to your graveyard, which is going to put a +1/+1 counter on her and scry 1. But even ignoring that text, she is a Gravedigger, right? She's a 4-mana 2/2 that whenever she comes in, you get a creature back from your graveyard. She can also get an enchantment back from your graveyard, right? Maybe one of those sagas that you finished. Just a lot of versatility on this card, so happy to see that. And then we've got Cursed Courtier, 2 and a white for a 3/3 human noble with lifelink, and when Cursed Courtier enters the battlefield, create a cursed roll token attached to it. Enchanted creature's a 1/1. So a couple things about this card. You control that cursed roll even though it's on your creature, so if you replace it with another roll, it falls off, and then you've put a roll on a lifelink creature, which is great. It also counts as 2 permanents entering the battlefield for celebration. There's just a lot of sort of hidden upside with this card, despite how it might look initially. And you can sacrifice the cursed roll to bargain. I forgot, right? If you have a bargain spell, you can sack that cursed roll, and then he's back to being a 3/3. And then we've got Ashiok's Reaper, 3 and a black for a 3/3 nightmare. Whenever an enchantment you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card. So a hill giant that essentially is like a reverse enchantress in terms of like you're replacing one of your rolls, you're overwriting a roll, you get to draw a card. You're finishing a saga, you get to draw a card. You're sacrificing an enchantment to bargain, you get to draw a card. Just a lot of different ways to make this a 2-for-1. And then we'll look at some of these other cards that go in the deck. We've got Savior of the Sleeping, which is 2 and a white for a 2/3 human knight with vigilance. Whenever an enchantment you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on Savior of the Sleeping. So a 2/3 vigilance for 3 is awful, but if you can even have one enchantment go to the graveyard, then this is now a 3/4. And, worth noting, both green and black have a 2-mana saga, so you play that on turn 2, play this guy on turn 3, and then on turn 4 you're automatically sacking the saga and automatically putting a counter on this by the first time it can attack. So, that's something to keep in mind. It's not that hard to put enchantments in the graveyard in this set. Knight of Doves, 2 and a white for a 1/3 human knight. Whenever an enchantment you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, create a 1/1 white bird creature token with flying. If you can do this even once, then that's a great rate. If you can do it twice, it's crazy. And then we've got Hopeless Nightmare. This is a single black for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card and loses 2 life. When Hopeless Nightmare is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, scry 2, and you can pay 2 and a black to sacrifice Hopeless Nightmare. So this card synergizes greatly with the other 2 cards we just talked about, really with this whole archetype. It also feels great to sack to bargain, right? Because you got that card off of it, your opponent discarded a card and lost 2 life, and then you also are getting this scry 2 when you sack it. So great card to look out for. Now we're going to talk about Red-White Celebration, and this format does not seem very aggressive to me at all. The creatures seem a little low-statted, but if a deck is going to be aggressive, I think it's definitely going to be the Red-White Celebration deck. So the signpost in common is Ash Party Crasher, 2-mana 2/2 legendary human peasant. With haste, whenever Ash Party Crasher attacks, if 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Ash. So this card's great, right? On the turn she comes in, she's probably just going to be swinging for 2. The only kind of problem is she does have to attack to get that +1/+1 counter, so you can't just have a couple turns of Celebration where you're bumping her up. She has to actually do the attack and put herself at risk. But Celebration is so easy to trigger with all of the things that make multiple tokens, the creatures that make a roll when they enter the battlefield, that sort of thing. So it's definitely worth considering that. We've got Belligerent of the Ball, 2 and a red for a 3/3 Ogre Warrior. With Celebration, at the beginning of combat on your turn, if 2 or more non-land permanents entered the battlefield under your control this turn, target creature you control gets +1/0 and gains Menace until end of turn. So, worth noting, this can target itself, which it often will be, because a 3-mana, 4/3 menace is a great body. But it can also target another creature that would maybe benefit more from the +1/0 and menace if you have Celebration. So, great aggressive creature. Speaking of great aggressive creatures, this next one is Gallant Pie Wielder. 2 and a white for 2/3 Dwarf Knight with first strike. And Celebration, it has a double strike instead. So if you've had two things come in, it's a 2/3 double strike for 3 mana, which is a pretty great body. A great thing to put a roll on, right? Because buffing a double strike creature, you're getting twice the value out of that buff. And next we've got, this is Imidane's Recruiter. It's 2 and a red for a 2/2 Human Knight. When Imidane's Recruiter enters the battlefield, creatures you control get +1/0 and haste until end of turn. So a pretty decent body for 3 mana. But it's also got an adventure called Train Troops, which is 4 and a white for a sorcery. Create 2 2/2 white knight creature tokens with vigilance. So the reason that is so good is because in one adventure for 5 mana, you are triggering Celebration, right, for 1 card. And then on the next turn, you can maybe double spell and trigger Celebration that way. And then we've got Grand Ball Guest, 1 and a red for a 2/2 Human Peasant. It gets +1/+1 and trample as long as 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn. So, more evidence that this Celebration deck is maybe going to be trying to be aggressive. Right, a roll on this plus that buff, that's a 4/4 coming in. And this deck is going to be looking for those roll cards naturally because of the Celebration thing. And then we've got maybe a less aggressive, more sustaining card, 2 Veil Guide, 3 and a white for a 2/3 Fairy Scout with flying. And Celebration, it gets +1/0 and lifelink as long as 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn. So if you've got Celebration turned on, that's a 6-point life swing when this attacks, which is pretty great to see for a 4-mana flyer. Not bad, for sure. Next we've got Blue-Red, which in this case is Spells and Adventures. So it starts with Johann, Apprentice Sorcerer, that's the signpost. 2 a blue and a red for a 2/5 Human Wizard. You can look at the top card of your library, and once each turn you may cast an instant or sorcery spell from the top of your library. So this is kind of like Melik, sort of a different version of Melik, made appropriate for like uncommon for this set. Interestingly, it is worded so that you can cast adventures off the top of your library. It's not an instant or sorcery card, you can cast an instant or sorcery spell from the top of your library, and if it's an adventure, it is an instant or sorcery spell, even if it's not on an instant or sorcery card. A little bit of rules minutia for you, but Blue-Red is Spellslinger in most limited formats. It's kind of had a hard time escaping that identity. But it adds this, it's nominally about adventures as well in this set, so it sort of adds that flavor. We've got, as one of the uncommons, Chancellor of Tales, 3 and a blue for a 2/3 Fairy Advisor with flying. Whenever you cast an adventure spell, you may copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. So we had Lucky Clover from the last Eldraine set, which actually ended up getting banned in Standard. I think it is very important that your adventure doubler dies to Lightning Bolt from a game design perspective, so I'm glad to see this Chancellor of Tales. It is a powerful card still, but being 4 mana and dying to removal is very important. And then we've got Hearth Elemental, 5 and a red for a 4/5 Elemental. This spell costs X less to cast, where X is the number of cards in your graveyard that are instants, sorceries, or have an adventure. So, it's going to be cheaper for your instants and sorceries, but it's also going to be cheaper for any of your adventure creatures that have died. And then we've got Stoke Genius, which is 1 and a red for a sorcery. Discard your hand, then draw 2 cards. So, pretty cool to see, like, if this is the last card in your hand, you would send it on that adventure and just draw 2 cards, right? And then have the creature sitting there, probably to be cast for cheap. This is a card that you can definitely sort of sculpt your game plan around to get a lot of value out of. And then we've got Frolicking Familiar, which is an Otter Wizard. Love that. It's an uncommon, 2 and a blue for a 2/2 with flying. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, Frolicking Familiar gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So it's got that more restrictive prowess. And then the instant is Blow Off Steam for a single red, 1 damage to any target. So not only does this trigger your other instant and sorcery options for cheap, but it also, it can remove things with 1 toughness, which is mostly going to be like rat tokens, human tokens, bird tokens. But it does have its uses, and if you have the mana sitting around, you can just aim it at your opponent's face. Nothing wrong with that. But getting a 3-mana 2/2 flyer with prowess, pseudo prowess, I guess, is pretty good. And then we've got Gadwick's First Duel, which is 1 in a blue. It's the blue saga. It's 1 in a blue. Step 1, create a cursed roll token attached up to 1 target creature. So you can turn one of your opponent's creatures into a 1/1. Step 2, scry 2. Step 3, when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell with mana value 3 or less this turn, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. So this card's great in terms of, it turns your opponent's best thing into a 1/1, then filters your draws, then lets you maybe have a big explosive turn where you're copying a removal spell. And then next we've got Unruly Catapult, which is 2 in a red for an artifact creature, a 0/4 construct, with Defender. You can tap it to deal 1 damage to each opponent, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, untap Unruly Catapult. So this is a sort of a more expensive Thermo Alchemist. The ability to just ping your opponent for 1 every turn cannot be understated in terms of, the board state's gummed up. I'm pinging you for 1 every turn, you have to find an answer to this, right? And then, when I draw a removal spell, I can ping you twice this turn, right? It's a clock that's easy to underestimate, and I wouldn't be surprised if this card saw a healthy amount of play. And then next we've got green-blue, which is mana value 5 or greater matters. So it's sort of this ramp deck that's trying to cast things that cost 5 or greater to get benefits. So the signpost uncommon is Troyan Gutsy Explorer. He's 1, a green and a blue for a 1/3 legendary Vidalcan Scout. Now you might say Vidalcan are not on Eldraine, but the Omen Paths, the marvelization of Magic's story, has brought Vidalcan Scouts to Eldraine, has brought Vidalcans who are not Planeswalkers to Eldraine. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. Troyan, 1, a green and a blue for a 1/3 Vidalcan Scout, legendary, taps for a green and a blue. Spend this mana only to cast spells with mana value 5 or greater, or spells with X in their mana costs. So this tapping for 2 mana is kind of crazy in terms of limited, in terms of ramping out. You can get a 5-drop on turn 3 with this. You can get a 6-drop on turn 4 with this, because he is 3 mana himself. But that's a good ability to have. And then you can pay a blue, tap, draw a card, and discard a card. So if you're later in the game and you're digging for one of those spells, you're digging for some action, then he can loot. So a very versatile creature. And then we've got Up the Beanstalk. 1 and a green for an enchantment. When Up the Beanstalk enters the battlefield, and whenever you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, draw a card. So this is going to let you sort of really take over in the late game. It replaces itself immediately, and then whenever you cast one of those 5 or greater spells that this deck wants you to cast, you're drawing a card. We've got Galvanic Giant. This is 3 and a blue for a 3/3 Giant Wizard. Whenever you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. So, worth noting, this also synergizes with the tap-down deck. But here's the other thing about it. It has an adventure, Storm Reading, for 5 and double blue, which is an instant. Draw 4 cards, then discard 2 cards. So, I think you're pretty often going to be just casting this as a creature and then getting that value out of casting big spells, but it's worth noting that it is a big spell if you have 7 mana. Then we've got the uncommon adventure creature for blue-green is Tempest Heart. It's 3 and a green for a 3/4 elemental elk with trample. Whenever you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, put a +1/+1 counter on Tempest Heart. So, you cast this on turn 4, on turn 5 you cast your 5-drop, and this immediately becomes a 4/5 trampler ready to attack, which is pretty great. And then the adventure is Scan the Clouds. It's an instant for 1 and a blue, draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards. So it's just some looting, some sort of hand filtering that's kind of optional before you actually play the Tempest Heart itself. And then we've got Skybeast Tracker, 3 and a green for a 2/4 Giant Archer with Reach. And whenever you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, create a food token. So it's a slight benefit to be getting off of casting your 5-drops, but it's also just great for blocking fairies. Fairies is a whole archetype in this set where most of the creatures are going to have flying in their deck, so having a Reacher is paramount. And then we've got Stormkeld Prowler, which is 1 and a blue for a 2/1 human rogue. Whenever you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, put 2 +1/+1 counters on Stormkeld Prowler. This card seems great. Becoming a 4/3 the first time you cast a spell that costs 5 or greater on your 2-drop, Really, really great return on investment. Last but not least for our archetypes, we've got black-green food. Now, black-green cared about food last time we went to Eldraine, but not like this. There are some powerful cards in this archetype. So the Signpost Uncommon, similar to the very powerful Signpost Uncommon of the previous Eldraine for food, is Greta, Sweet-Tooth Scourge. She's 1, a black and a green for a 3/3 human warrior, legendary at Uncommon. When Greta, Sweet-Tooth Scourge enters the battlefield, create a food token. And for those who don't remember, a food token is an artifact. You can pay 2, tap, and sack it to gain 3 life. But she gives you other stuff to do with your food. You can pay a green and sack a food to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Activate only as a sorcery. And you can pay 1 and a black and sack a food to draw a card and lose a life. No such sorcery restriction on that one. So she lets you, if the life is not useful to you, she lets you turn your food into cards or into +1/+1 counters to sort of push through. So a very versatile card that gives your foods a lot of relevance. Now we've got Knight of Sweet's Revenge, which is 3 and a green for an enchantment. When Knight of the Sweet's Revenge enters the battlefield, create a food token. Foods you control can tap for a green, and you can pay 7 mana, 5 and double green, sacrifice Knight of the Sweet's Revenge. Creatures you control get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of foods you control. Activate only as a sorcery. So in a very dedicated food deck, this can be like an overrun. It can be like a way to win the game late in the game. I think it's a little bit too janky, but it's definitely something to keep an eye out for. It's very much asks you to really dedicate yourself to the food deck. We've got Sweet-Tooth Witch, 2 and a black for a common 3/2 human warlock. When it enters the battlefield, create a food token, and you can pay 2 mana, sacrifice a food, target player loses 2 life. So a 3 mana 3/2 that makes a food when it comes in is perfectly serviceable, right? It trades, and you get to keep the food. But if this thing can survive, your foods can hit your opponent instead of healing you, which is very, very powerful. Now we've got Hollow Scavenger, which is 2 and a green for a 3/2 wolf. You can pay 1 and sack a food to give it +2/+2 until end of turn. Activate only once each turn. Now, what's useful here is, again, that threat of activation, where if you just have a food, you don't actually have to spend it. Your opponent's not going to block unless they can trade with the big version of this. But it's also got a Sorcery Adventure Bakery Raid for a single green, create a food token. So it gives itself that food token that it needs to have that threat of activation on the ability. Very solid card. Then we've got Tough Cookie. Actually, one of the first cards spoiled from this set. It's 1 and a green for a 2/2 food golem. It's an artifact creature. When it enters the battlefield, you create a food, so you've got it and another food. And you can pay 2 and a green, target non-creature artifact you control becomes a 4/4 artifact creature until end of turn. And then, of course, it's got the food ability to pay 2, tap, sack it, gain 3 life. So, something really interesting about this is, it makes the food, and then it can also turn your foods into creatures to attack or block. Which, gives them sort of a new utility. Then we got Minstrosity. We talked about that earlier. It's the 2 mana 3/1 in black. When it dies, you make a food. Just a solid creature for trading, and then, it leaves the food behind, and you can do the things your deck cares about with food there. Alright, now we're going to begin talking about the best bombs in the set. In other words, the rares and mythics that are most likely to win you the game on the spot. Obviously, I dedicate most of these guides to commons and uncommons for the purpose of that being most of what you see in a given session of playing Limited, a draft, or a pre-release. But I do like to talk about the best rares so that you kind of know what you're up against, you know what to look at in pack one, pick one, and be like, oh, okay, I'll take this and build my deck around it. So we've got Moonshaker Cavalry, 5 and triple white for a 6/6 Spirit Knight with flying. When it enters the battlefield, creatures you control gain flying and get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. This is a white Craterhoof Behemoth. It's giving flying instead of trample, and it doesn't have haste, but, an absurd card that's likely to just end the game on the spot if you control even just a couple creatures. Realm Scorcher Hellkite, 4 and double red for a 4/6 with Bargain. It's a dragon. It's got flying and haste. And when it enters the battlefield, if it was bargained, you add 4 mana and any combination of colors. And then you can pay 1 and a red. Realm Scorcher Hellkite deals 1 damage to any target. So the reason I put it in this bomb territory is because of that ability to deal 1 damage to any target, right? If you've cast this, then you have 6 mana. So at the very least, you can be dealing 3 damage divided as you choose every turn. And that's just going to eat away at so many board states, or if your opponent's at a low life total, eat away at that. So it's another mythic that's very powerful. And then we've got Gruff Triplets, 3 and triple green for a 3/3 Satyr Warrior with Trample at rare. When Gruff Triplets enters the battlefield, if it isn't a token, create 2 tokens that are copies of it. When Gruff Triplets dies, put a number of +1/+1 counters equal to its power on each creature you control named Gruff Triplets. So this is obviously insane. Even if they're able to exile one of the triplets, the second one dying puts 3 counters on the other one, right? If your first Gruff Triplets dies, the other 2 become 6/6s. And then, Nightmare Scenario, that other one dies, and then the remaining one is a 12/12. So this card's just great. It's super hard to deal with. Even if for some reason, let's say they have a Rest in Peace out, because that's in the enchantments, right? And these are not able to die. You still just paid 6 mana for 3/3/3s. This card feels practically unbeatable. Take it every time. We've got Horned Lock Whale, which is 4 and double blue for a 6/6 whale with flash and ward 2. Horned Lock Whale enters the battlefield tapped unless it's your turn. So, you can't flash it into block, boo-hoo. But it is a ward 2 6/6 for 6. And then it's got Lagoon Breach, 1 and a blue for an instant. The owner of target attacking creature you don't control puts it on the top or bottom of their library. So that's a very powerful card. You get to... It's a removal spell for an attacking creature, and then it's a big-ass creature. And then next we've got Ashiok, Wicked Manipulator. Second card designed after my ex-wife. 3 and double black for a legendary planeswalker with 5 loyalty. If you would pay life while your library has at least that many cards in it, exile that many cards from the top of your library instead. So anytime you're asked to pay life, you would instead exile cards from your library. +1, look at the top 2 cards of your library, exile one of them and put the other in your hand. -2, create 2 1/1 black nightmare creature tokens with, at the beginning of combat on your turn, if a card was put into exile this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. -7, target player exiles the top X cards of their library, where X is the total mana value of cards you own in exile. So, not that hard for the ultimate to win the game, but the big thing being that this can minus to make 1/1s, minus to make 1/1s, plus to filter your draws, to draw you a card with some selection and put counters on those 1/1s. And then we've got Virtue of Loyalty. This is 3 and double white for an enchantment. We'll talk about the adventure on it first. It's Ardenvale Fealty, 1 and a white for an instant, with an adventure, an instant adventure. Create a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance. So important to remember, you can flash this in and trade it with something, or you can just flash this in and eat a 1/1. The fact that it's an instant is relevant. And then at the beginning of your end step, the enchantment itself is 5 mana. At the beginning of your end step, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Untap those creatures. So, just that inevitability of, every end step, you're buffing your team. All your creatures have pseudo-vigilance. Just a very, very powerful effect on a mythic. Now, I want to talk about tips and tricks. Just things I've noticed about the set in my practice drafts. Now, normally in these set reviews, I only talk about the best cards of each color and then the cards that go in archetypes. So, and normally there aren't enough good colorless cards to really hit my radar. But this set has 3 particularly, I think, powerful artifacts that I wanted to give a shout out to. Collector's Vault is an artifact for 2 mana at uncommon. You can pay 2, tap, draw a card, discard a card, create a treasure token. So this does kind of a weird, Maze Mind Tome, Reckoner Bankbuster impression, in terms of, it's a great way to spend your mana late in the game. It gives you the return of that treasure token, which can be fixing as well. And is something to bargain away. So just a lot of synergy on this card, in addition to the fact that it just sort of filters your draws. 3 Bowls of Porridge. I do love the story that this card tells. It's a 2 mana artifact food. You can pay 2, tap, choose one that hasn't been chosen. 3 Bowls of Porridge, it deals 2 damage to target creature, tap target creature, or sacrifice 3 Bowls of Porridge, you gain 3 life. So, the ability to tap something down, and that's the one you're probably most often going to skip. Kill something with the 2 damage, and then, it's a food afterward. Just a really interesting card, just kind of over the course of the game, generates a little bit more value than you'd expect out of an artifact. And then we've got Candy Trail. Now, this is one I'm kind of torn on. it reads very powerful. It's a single mana for an artifact, Food Clue. When Candy Trail enters the battlefield, scry 2. You can pay 2 tap and sacrifice Candy Trail to gain 3 life and draw a card. This card seems so solid to me. You know, the fact that it scries when it comes in, and then you just have the ability to, like, crack it whenever to gain 3 life and draw a card. Like, it just seems very... It seems like it does a lot for the mana cost, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was very good in draft. You know, if any non-aggro deck kind of wanted a copy or 2 of this card. And then I wanted to talk real quick. There's a cycle of enemy-colored manlands. This is not a very splash-friendly set. These maybe make that a little bit easier, and some of them are quite powerful. You know, for instance, this green-black one that becomes a 4/4 that's like a solid body. It makes a food when it attacks, and exiles something from a graveyard. But just be aware of these. This is the land cycle for the set, and they can do things in limited. They can become blockers, right? That you know, in limited, you're not often looking at your opponent's lands and making sure that they're not going to mess up your combat, but here they can, so make sure to pay attention to that. And then the last thing I kind of wanted to talk about is whether you should splash in this set, and I think the answer is a pretty firm no. We've got Crystal Grotto, we've got a land that sort of taps for a color of your choice and then does something with adventures at uncommon, and then we've got Evolving Wilds. But anymore, that's kind of the standard for sets to include, and that doesn't really mean you should be splashing outside of a particularly powerful rare. The only 3-color combination I really see working semi-consistently is probably Temur, working off of like the blue-green and the red-green deck both being ramp decks. But I really wouldn't suggest it. So those are my thoughts, but I'm curious how this will actually end up shaking out. With all that said, I want to give a huge thank you to anybody who made it all the way to the end. I love making this content. It's just a fun hobby for me, and I really, really love to make things be a discussion. You know, I want to hear what you have to say about what I had to say in the comments. Were there any cards you feel like I left out? Any cards you're particularly excited to play with? Any cards you think were silly of me to include that you don't think will pan out? I'm really, really, really excited to play this limited format and see how it shakes out, and I'm really excited to involve you all in the process. I want to hear what you think. And most of all, I hope you have a wonderful day. Feel free to like and subscribe. It would really help the channel grow. And have a good one.